So the way I enter conversations is often similar to how I approach life, although you do have to plan certain things, obviously, but there's a lot of like openness. Let's see what comes on my path, which again, to many people will feel like a form of insecurity. That's part of not knowing and just being the delight of surprising conversations. Podcasting has been a way for me to embrace that both in my research and in other contexts.
Hello, and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abbie, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Simone Eringfeld as we take a communication perspective on podcasting as a research method. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we are making and how we are making it through our communication practices. It means seeing ourselves as active participants with choices about how we show up to each other. It is paying attention to patterns, context, stories, and relationships to better understand how meaning gets made. It is embodying curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to co-create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the idea is that by looking at communication instead of through it, in this conversation and in all that we do, we expand our collective imagination through both storytelling and story hearing, revealing new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Simone Eringfeld. Simone is the author of the recent book, Podcasting as a Research Method. She is also the creator of 3 different podcasts. Something I would have you keep in mind as we enter into this conversation is this idea of research, whether you are an academic or not, whether you are someone that does formal research or not. What does trial and error, what does research, what does experimentation, what does play look like in your life as you learn things and take risks and try new things and find new ways of learning and also communicating? And I think that's all I'll say for now, because Simone and I are really going to get into some interesting things today, and I think I'm ready to just jump right in. So let's begin the conversation with Simone. Hello, Simone. Thank you so much for joining me for this podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to be talking with you and jumping right in, going into my honestly, I think favorite question, which is some variation on how are we arriving to this conversation. I found it to be such an important question for the tone that it sets for the rest of the conversation in terms of the stories that can emerge and the kind of maybe messy areas or meandering exploration we can do by how we get to know each other in this very first moment. So giving you a second to think about how you're arriving. What I want to share is that I am so excited to be talking with you today, a fellow podcaster, about podcasting. I know that this is getting into a little bit of a meta kind of conversation as we're talking about podcasting while we're podcasting, but I've been interested and focused on interpersonal communication for years now. And I've been using podcasting as the medium the whole time. But only recently have I really begun to articulate and share why I think it's such a powerful tool. Mm-hmm. And I loved podcast as a listener before I had my own. And now that I do this and have been expanding it in a couple different ways, doing kind of other podcast mini series that are different than the format of this podcast, traveling and doing like live podcasting at events to try to capture a bunch of stories. I'm just becoming more and more convinced of how important a tool and a medium podcasting is. Mm-hmm. Particularly for me, I think for the accessibility of it, because the ideas that I'm working with can feel really dense and they're very theoretical and there's a lot of scholarship around them. Accessibility is a really important question for me because while there's a deep theory, there's also a really important practical side to things where we get into this space of better communication does have the power to create better social worlds. And so that's something we need to be practicing, is really important to invite people into. Now, I don't want to overuse the phrase now more than ever, but I think everything feels now more than ever to some extent, especially as someone living in the United States. I'm thinking that these communication and relational skills are important now more than ever, even though they probably always have been important. So I guess what I'll say is that most of the people that come on my podcast are not also themselves podcasters, or don't have a lot of experience being on other podcasts. And so I think, and I'm hoping that this is going to be kind of a unique conversation where we can get into maybe some of the behind the scenes and just, I hope in a helpful way, name for people who are listening kind of what some intentions are when podcasting, or the hopes of what gets created, so that as they help to kind of, co-create in a way the podcast as the listener, a very important piece of it, they can maybe become more aware of the things that like you and I are seeing as we podcast. So again, I'm just thrilled to be able to get to nerd out about podcasting with you today. And as improvisation and emergence and exploration are really important practices in the communication perspective, I just want to name and appreciate the way that this has come about, which is that a colleague of mine mentioned you to me maybe a week or two ago. I dove into your work and was just so excited to find it. Perfect timing. Your book has just come out, reached out to you, and here we are, a week and a half maybe later, recording a podcast. So I just thank you for being open to that kind of immediate turnaround to just dive in and see what this conversation can be. So that's the context I'd love to share to you. Simone, how are you arriving?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's interesting. It's tempting to immediately dive into a discussion of podcasting with some of the things that you've already said. But yeah, it's funny how things can move so quickly, right? And how new connections can be formed in this way. I'm sure that your colleague must have probably found out about me because my book was just released 2 weeks ago, and there's been some like promotional activities and some outreach and yeah, all of that. Interesting because my editor, so I've published this book called Podcasting as a Research Method, which is obviously all about podcasting in research contexts, and my editor posted on it on LinkedIn and it sort of went viral.
Mm.
Lots of people engaging, sharing the post, commenting, saying that they really wanted a book like this and they'd been using podcasting in their practice and had been looking for some type of guides to help them understand the different options, the ways of using it as a method. So I've been connecting with a lot of podcast fans these past couple of weeks, which has been really exciting. So I'm arriving to this conversation with a lot of optimism and excitement about podcasting, just having seen to me, it was unexpected, just the amount of responses, the positivity that I got, the excitement from people saying, oh, we were waiting for a book like this. And I'm like, wow, this is absolutely amazing. And beyond that, it's a busy time for me. We're recording this in May, mid-May. I just came back from Albania a couple days ago.
Wow.
Yeah, I was there at a dance festival. I'm actually a huge, passionate dancer. Partner dance is what I do. Kizomba, salsa, bachata, that sort of thing. And I'm packing my bags because in 2 days I'm going to the Faroe Islands, which is next to Iceland. And it's for an academic conference because I'm a scientist. I do polar science. And I'll be doing a little road trip there and exploring a different part of this beautiful earth and making some sound recordings. So a lot of travel and a lot of thoughts and ideas, connecting with people about sound and podcasting. Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. And yes, it sounds like you are so busy. And so I'm grateful for how this fits in and you've contextualized us in terms of where you've come from and where you're going. And I think we're starting to get a really good introduction for you. And I'm wondering if we could go a step further by me asking us to start to hone in on the podcasting role that we share and introduce yourself as a podcaster. and maybe tell us some stories, if you have any that are coming to mind, about what led you to do the work that you do at this intersection of, I know, podcasting and climate change. And I think there's probably a couple other
Mhm.
things that intersect for you that you could probably name, I imagine.
Yes, absolutely. I'm currently working on my third podcast, and they've all been very different. So the first time I produced a podcast was, I think, 6 or 7 even years ago, 6 years ago. I was doing my master's at the University of Cambridge in educational studies and education and international development. And I had been planning on this big research project in a refugee camp in Uganda. But it was 2019, 2020. That was the academic year. So we
Ah,
all know
yes.
what happened. Big disruption thanks to the COVID pandemic, which meant that I could no longer go and do the
Mm.
field work I had planned. And instead, I had to come up with a different idea. But now that we all were like doing this social distancing, and classes, everything had moved online. I wasn't able to see my peers anymore, professors. I figured, actually, since I'm studying education anyways, it might be really interesting to look at what's happening right around me, my own environments, my own current studies that I'm undertaking at Cambridge, and looking at the impact of COVID on higher education and on how people were thinking about the future of the university post COVID, in terms of their hopes and fears for how this pandemic might impact higher education. And then, because I was basically not able to leave my home, my student accommodation that I was living at the time, I figured, okay, how am I going to connect with people? How am I going to get it? How am I going
Mhm.
to get my data? And so I figured, let me do these remote interviews, but I don't want them to be private conversations because we're all trying to make sense of this crisis that we're currently in.
Yes. Yeah.
So maybe if I share these conversations with other students at this university or even beyond Cambridge, because we were all in this shared experience, this could be helpful and it could, in a way, alleviate some of the loneliness a lot of people
Hmm.
were experiencing, a lot of
Yeah.
that disconnect, um, a type of collectively trying to make sense of what was happening. And so I started out my first podcast with this idea, first of all, in mind of just creating something to stay in touch with other peers, with professors, and have it be something that could be useful to other people as well. And then I figured, actually, I could use this as a research method. I could use
Hmm.
past interviews as the way to collect my data and then to analyze the interviews. And well, there's a lot of creative options for how to actually use it as a method. But this is my first podcast, Cambridge Quarant Chats. It was the idea that it's chats during quarantine.
Yes.
Um, and that's how it started. And then that was an interview-based podcast. My second podcast, I also have a business, a company. I'm a coach for neurodivergent people, specifically gifted people. And I recorded coaching conversations. So not interviews, but
Mm.
me coaching gifted people that I'd never met before to also show others what is coaching like. And also, again, so that this conversation could benefit more than just a single person, because it benefits obviously the person that I'm coaching, but now
Yes.
through podcasting, many people with the same type of issues or doubts or thoughts or things that they're struggling with could listen in on this conversation and think, that actually might be useful for me too. And I hadn't thought of it before in this way. So I guess you can see some parallels between those two podcasts, even though they're so different. And now I'm working on my third podcast, which is again so different. I'm not talking to anyone for this podcast, not in an interview, not in a coaching style. Because I'm doing a PhD in polar studies, also at the University of Cambridge, and I'm currently about to finish. part of my PhD is producing a podcast on my research, which is looking at tourism in Antarctica and the
Mm.
sonic experiences of tourists of the Antarctic soundscapes and how it sort of impacts their sense of place and their emotional connection to Antarctica and potentially their desire to protect Antarctic environments. And this podcast is very different. It's a type of ethnographic podcasting where I am taking listeners with me into Antarctic soundscapes. So you get a sense of what it's like to be there, even having never been there yourself. So it's a way of traveling, seeing parts of the world, hearing parts of the world that you would otherwise not typically visit. And it's more experimental. I'm doing some soundscape composition. There's some snippets of like conversations in there. There's impressions of what it's like to be on an expedition ship, because this is how most people travel to Antarctica. It's a very rich experience, but also very challenging to produce this because I came home with so much material. In the sense, it's way more confined to say, okay, I'm going to meet this person for a conversation. We're going to have this conversation, and afterwards there might still be some hard decisions to make on what parts of the conversation to keep and what to leave out. But in the Antarctica podcast case, I came home from having spent almost 4 months in that region,
Oh,
and
wow.
my
That's a
life,
lot of audio you came home
it's
with then.
so much audio. I was so overwhelmed. I'm still overwhelmed because I'm producing it right now and I finished the first episode, but it's just such an extensive library of recordings that I'm like, where am I even going to start? How am I going to pick, select which bits to use? It's not easy, but it's a good challenge now.
Yes, that's incredible to hear about. And it's again, yeah, so interesting and so great to get a sense of all of these count as podcasting, and yet they look so different. And I'm curious for I've just come myself from an academic conference about the communication studies discipline, and that was just incredibly rich time I spent. And so I have this kind of more scholarly understanding of research in my mind, having just heard a bunch of paper presentations and panels. And so I'm curious how you kind of delineate your experience calling it podcasting versus other people that do like formal research like you're doing that say, well, yeah, I record my interviews too. I just don't share them. So what's kind of like the difference? What does that do for you to say, no, this is podcasting and I'm doing the next step of sharing it? And what are you learning when you share it that, creates something different than if you were just recording research interviews?
There's a few differences there. Keeping your interviews private versus sharing them on a podcast. I mean, that doesn't suit just every project, right? Because
Yeah.
sometimes a project will require more higher level of anonymity, of privacy. It might be more sensitive topics that you're dealing with. But in the situations where it is interesting to share the research interviews, it can serve dual purpose of being both research, but also just really engaging interviews that in and of themselves as data could enrich someone else's understanding of a particular topic. You could also look at the engagement that a podcast gets afterwards. So the conversation doesn't have to end after we sort of end our conversation, because then other people can listen in and have their thoughts and have their responses to it, and so it can become a more of a collective group activity. Yeah, I think there's many benefits to it, and also the idea of podcasting not just being a way of disseminating research results. So this is the most common way that podcasting gets used in research context. I've already
Yeah.
completed the project and now I'm going to talk to someone about my findings. But in my case, I'm giving people a few options of how to use podcasting earlier on in a research process. So actually using it as a way of collecting data, of maybe having it be part of the analysis of or it could be part of the writing up, so to say. So the way in which I'm currently producing my Antarctic podcast is a way of not just writing about my findings, but also speaking about them, but not just in a way of disseminating, but really, as a way of processing the
Yes.
things I heard and the things that I found. And yeah, there's so many different options. It's such a the versatility is huge with podcasting. You can go so many different directions, and there's so much space for creativity, and that's what I really love about this medium.
Yeah, I think that something I'm interested to hear your thoughts on as well, just again from my own world of things, is that being really steeped in this world of interpersonal communication. And I talk about communication as a very expansive thing, not to get too broad, but there's an argument for everything is communication.
Mhm.
Everything we do communicates something. And the point I'm really trying to make is it's not just words. It's a lot about how we show up to and what the different things we do or don't do, or what our presence communicates when we're the one speaking, when we're the one listening, when we're in a group, kind of co-creating an experience together. And so having that in mind, coming to a podcast, for me, it's so much about, I guess the word I'll use is modeling. And I don't even mean that as like sage on the stage kind of dynamic where, well, I know what's up, let me show you, and then you do it, but more of just let me try to embody this way of being in all that I do. And then because the nature of podcasting is that I'm sharing it widely, I hope that that demonstrates what that might look like so that people could then try that out for themselves, because so much of, I think, communication and finding whatever the phrase that I use a lot is like, if we're taking this social constructionist lens, better communication can create better social worlds. So what does that better look like? So the way of kind of defining better for yourself or for your relationships or for your social worlds is a little bit of trial and error. And so I like to talk about not just podcasting, but life and interactions and conversations as research or as an experiment, as play, as practice. I was a theater kid myself, so the word rehearsal makes sense to me. But if someone did sports, then maybe practice makes more sense. But I think that's one, a very generous way to look at things, because it maybe lowers the stakes a little bit to say, yeah, this is just something I'm trying out and I'm learning and I'm inquiring and I'm seeing what happens and I'm going back and changing my method, like just learning as we go, I think is such a powerful tool, and thinking about life as one big experiment. And, if you have experience in formal research, then there's maybe even more of a metaphor to be distilled there about like a hypothesis and, the methods that you would use for inquiry. If you don't have that experience, I think it's still a meaningful frame to say you're just playing, you're just learning, and it's just one big, let's see what happens. And so I wonder, as you were talking about a more formal kind of research than what I'm describing here, I'm curious about where that meets or how you feel about that, or what. I'm asking so many questions here that's maybe not helpful.
That's okay.
I think what I want to focus on is like beyond, let's say lowercase, just the concept of podcasting as a research method. What does your book, capitals, podcasting as a research method, or your take on the more formal kind of research than what I'm talking about, what does that add? Like, what's the layer there beyond what I'm talking about, or what's the relationship between the more informal kind of podcasting as a research method and the more formal podcasting as a research method? Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Some of it.
I think I said a lot there.
No, it's interesting because I really resonate with the idea of play and experimentation in life and in research. Um, and I think I do lots of different things in my life and in my career. I'm very much a multi-passionate, multi-path person.
Hmm.
Um, but something that is like a common red thread connecting the many things that I do is my love for good conversations. I just love a good conversation.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite ways to connect with someone. And conversations can go in so many different ways and directions. And, like as a coach, I have these conversations that get people to gain new insights and like these aha moments, or they see different patterns, or they suddenly see a vision or a way forward. And it's beautiful how a conversation, the power of a single conversation can be life changing. Now, as a researcher, I'm also, I love asking questions. I'm just really curious. What is this like? How does that work? What's the experience for you like? It's stepping into different worlds and exploring and playing in that sense through conversation with these different ways of thinking and being and acting and doing. Um, but another context in which this happens is I've currently been spending a lot of time going on dates, first dates with people.
Yeah.
I I love dates. I love going on dates because especially with different people. It's also like having follow-up dates with the same person as you get deeper and deeper, but also
Sure.
just like how beautiful this magic of
Mm.
showing up to a bar or a cafe or whatever and meeting a stranger and then spending an hour and a half, 2 hours, asking them questions and learning about their lives and how they think and how they see the world. I love a good conversation in all these different settings, whether it's dating or research.
Yeah, listeners,
So,
I'm nodding vigorously just so people know because that is speaking so to me. I think it's like this the most beautiful thing. So I absolutely agree with you. And then it's
yeah,
amazing to be able to put that in a podcast and share
yeah,
it because I think for me the other kind of fundamental core of this is meaning. Like when I referenced social construction earlier, a lot of that, I guess the whole point of that is that meaning is socially constructed and people together are the constructors of that meaning. And so I think like you're talking about the questions, and I would love to kind of dive deeper into that because something that I've again learned through my own podcasting as research and just life conversations is that a tool that I think so many of us forget about is a very simple question of what do you mean by that? Or what does that
mhm,
mean to you? Just a clarifying question of meaning, which acknowledges we might not necessarily be making the same meaning of the thing. And so I want to clarify that. But that can feel like such a scary question. Like I've already referenced before a couple times on this podcast, an experience I had on this podcast a while ago. We're in a conversation where we were talking about expectations and assumptions. I kind of shared this big long thing, and then the person I was talking to goes, I don't really know what you meant by that. And the panic like rose up in me because we have this idea that good communication is about being perfectly understood.
mhm.
And so you see like a moment where clarification needs to happen as like a communication failure. But I think it's important for us to change our mind about that and say, no, that just is a part of communication. And so I'm
Yeah.
curious about in your experience where you would point to like meaning making in terms of the conversations you're having, how it helps, the kind of questions you're asking, like you just revealed, or in the sharing that you do, maybe feedback you get from people that listen to your podcast. Where are it's everywhere, basically, is my argument at least. But where are you really beginning to pay attention to meaning making as this collective process that you're engaging people in as you're podcasting?
Mhm. Oh, meaning making, it happens everywhere all the time. So just this question alone, my mind is going in like a thousand different directions at once and like trying to pick one. I think the meaning making, it happens everywhere. It happens when we are in conversation, obviously, and misunderstandings, miscommunications happen and are part of communication, and it can sometimes be frustrating or difficult to understand. Like, how could we have had such a different perception or experience having had the same conversation, which turns out not to have been the same conversation?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's also in listening that there's a lot of meaning making that happens. So in Antarctica, I took tourists out on a boat to go cruising around icebergs and looking for wildlife. And we would bring microphones and make recordings of the penguins we found or the seals or the whales, or we would even put hydrophones into the water. So it's for underwater
Wow.
recording and listen to the icebergs. And it was like these unfamiliar sounds of like popping and cracking. And it sounded like, you know, people couldn't understand what is it that we're listening to because it's so
Yeah.
unexpected. And it's like this process of meaning making happening in real time where people are like, what is going on? How do I make sense of what I'm hearing? And people would then revert back to more familiar sounds that they could compare it to, such as, oh, it sounds like oil when it's hot and you're cooking something, or it sounds like a fizzy lollipop when I, put it in my mouth and it makes all these popping sounds, or it sounds like popcorn, or it sounds like a rainforest or a river, or it reminds me of where I grew up. And we had this sort of tap running in the bathroom, and this is the sound that it reminds me of, stuff like that. And then it becomes a very rich, imaginative world where we're listening to an iceberg in Antarctica with a group of maybe 10 people, but every one of us is having like different associations and different sentimentality connected to it, or even a nostalgia. And it becomes a very layered, different experience for each person there. Um, but then my mind also went to not just speaking or listening, but also as a dancer. I do,
Mm.
so as I mentioned, I do a lot of partner dance. So a couple of days ago, I was still in Albania. I was at this congress where dancers from all over the world fly in to have these workshops with these artists and to dance with one another and to have these socials and these parties where we practice, and you switch partners all the time, and every single person has a slightly different way of communicating non-verbally through body cues and different ways of leading different movements. It's like a different language, right? You have a leader and you have a follower. So the leader is saying, oh, I want you to turn this way, or I want you to go into this cross move, or put your foot there and like now walk around me, or like twirl in a particular way. And as a follower, you have no idea in advance what's going to be happening, right? It's not not a choreography. So you have to interpret in the moment all the time. Okay, what does the leader want me to do? How am I going to interpret what he's trying to communicate? And that might not always be what the leader wants, but then in the miscommunications where you have a different understanding of what the leader is putting out there, the most beautiful things can happen actually
Yeah.
when the communication goes wrong, quote unquote. It's not actually wrong. This is when a lot of beautiful mistakes can happen, where it's like, wow, that's a whole new move, or like a communication that we just discovered. And that's actually one of my favorite parts of partner dance, is when these mistakes happen that aren't mistakes, and they lead to the most hilarious connecting bonding moments where you just did something completely unexpected.
Hey, it's Abbie here, taking a pause in this conversation to invite you to reflect with me about how this episode is hitting you so far. If you're wanting to learn more about the coordinated management of meaning theory that I reference in this conversation, I'd recommend checking out the CMM Institute Substack for additional educational resources. If you're loving what you're hearing and are curious to learn more about CMM in different contexts, use the link in the show notes to follow the CMM Institute event page, where you can stay up to date with our monthly webinars hosted by yours truly. These events are an opportunity to gather with our community and explore CMM in different ways. And if you're looking to be even more connected, you can peruse our other CMM Institute initiatives, like our free social emotional learning resources, Cosmo Activities, which feature ways to engage all ages in conversations about building better social worlds. Links to all of these can be found in the show notes. As we turn toward the second half of this episode, I invite you to reconnect with your body and your environment. As the music plays to take us back to the conversation, take a breath, sink into your body wherever you are, take in your surroundings, and settle in for some more stories. Let's get back into it. feel like I could not have crafted two better like stories, examples of meaning making and kinds of communication if I had tried. So thank you for those beautiful stories because I feel like that makes it feel so real. And I have so many things I want to say, but a specific curiosity I have about your dancing life is I'm comparing it to like improvisation. I work with a lot of people that are like improv performers or jazz musicians. So we use a lot of like musical or improv jamming metaphors. And something that I feel in myself, at least, is I remember being like, if I think a very self-conscious kid, and maybe we'd play a game. There's one that's specifically coming to mind that was, I remember it being called Little Sally Walker, and everyone stood in a circle, maybe in like a gym class. And one person went in the middle. We all sang a song. They skipped around, stopped in front of one person, did a little dance, and then you switch and you do the same dance they just did, and then you're the person skipping around the circle. And I remember being like, that was my worst nightmare because I was so like a self-conscious child, and it was just coming up with something, and I hope it's funny or I hope I don't look stupid. I'm in middle school and that's all I want. And so improv, performance, things like that have always seemed very intimidating to me, but it's become less so over the years as I realize I'm actually always improvising. In everything I do, there's like an element of improvisation in these great conversations we have because you don't know what the other person's going to say, and that's what communication is. It's turn by turn, maybe in a similar way to your dance. So I'm very curious about the moment or the stretch of time where you start dancing. I don't know if that's as a child or in your adult life when you kind of started getting into this and going from, I'm projecting on you, but maybe a sense of, ooh, that seems kind of scary. I don't know how to do the following lead. I don't know how to listen to my dance partner to know this is fun and magical, the way that
Mhm,
this communication happens.
yeah. Well, I started dancing during my PhD because I needed something to counter the sort of mental activities that I was doing
Yes.
on my own. So I was looking for a way to connect with others and be in my body rather than in my head. And this was a perfect way to do so. So I started with salsa, then bachata, and then kizomba, which is what I do now. Um, and at first it was awkward
Mhm.
and odd. First of all, to be this close to someone physically is not something that was common for me. And so that took some time getting used to. And then understanding how to interpret, how to listen with your body and
Mm.
respond in through body movements to what was being said and having a dialogue or a conversation in this way. And so yeah, at the start it was a bit awkward, something very much yeah, of needing to get used to it. But then it became muscle memory and just like I don't have to think, my body just responds. Like it's become such an automatic thing for me. Like in just to give you an example, in Kizomba, if a leader has their arm around your waist or like close to your ribs, and they make sort of like an upward motion, it often means that you need to lift your leg up. So it's a leg
Mm.
lift. Now, as soon as I even just feel a tiny bit of that, my leg just goes up. Like it just happens
Yeah.
without me thinking. I'm like, sometimes it can be really ridiculous because they make a little joke and they just go up, down, and my leg just can't not respond.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm there like an idiot, up, down, up, down. So it's become completely natural and normal, so
Hmm.
ingrained in my body and how it responds to different cues, and I can't not do it almost. It feels really weird for me to not respond to those leads anymore. Um, yeah, and it's a wonderful way of having a non-verbal way of communicating with someone. But then another interesting thing is that you might have an amazing connection on a dance floor with someone where the conversation just flows effortlessly, and it's like this magical process where you really it's just effortless. But then you step off the dance floor and you try to have a verbal conversation with someone, and it's just the roughest, most awkward conversation where you're like, what are we even going to talk about? I have nothing to
Yeah.
say. Just there's no flow, no connection, all the magic is gone. And that
Mm,
actually also fascinates me, where with someone we could have this amazing dance connection, physical connection, but then with that same person, the verbal communication can be really just not flowing at all. It's yeah, we it just shows that there are so many different ways of connecting with someone,
yeah.
and communication happens all the time, everywhere, in so many shapes and forms. And one particular form of communication might work really well, whereas another might fall flat.
Hmm.
Mm.
That's so, so beautiful. And the thing that's coming to mind as you're speaking is, I guess, just the idea of like again, going back to my language, because, and I'm not, I hope this doesn't sound like you're saying something, I'm going back to my thing, but because I really do see like the communication perspective is a lens. And that's how I see myself in these conversations, how I kind of situate myself as like, I'm the representative of the communication perspective. And we're using that to understand what you're talking about. And so using my communication perspective lens, what I'm seeing and what you're saying is a real emphasis on, again, going back to my language of like better communication, that better isn't contingent on, well, I, Abbie, am a good communicator, so I make better communication happen, but that better is happens in the space between us in our relationship. And so you could be a really good dancer,
Yeah.
but if your partner isn't understanding the cues, then that the communication won't happen in the same way. Or off the dance floor, if you know, it's the betweenness. It
Yeah.
is, you know, both people coming together to truly co-create something. And I think there's, maybe for me, I can name frustration in that sometimes, because
Yeah.
I want to create beautiful communication with people,
Yeah.
and a lot of intrigue maybe, and also potential. And
Mhm.
maybe it takes the pressure off the individual a little bit to say, well, I'm not fully in control here. And that can feel scary, I think, because there's this like mystery element
Yeah.
to, all I can do is say what I say and maybe try to communicate my message the best, whether that's through words, whether that's through a touch when I'm dancing with a partner like you're referencing. And all I can do is let you interpret it and then respond. You know, it's this just back and forth of meaning
Yeah.
making over time. And I think it's a challenging and important process. And, you know, another perspective I think that I could weave in here is that, but going back to like learning or researching or experimenting, that we, all our lives, I think we've always been learning about communication, because
Mhm.
the way your parents talk to each other or to you or to others, that teaches you something.
Mhm.
Oh, that's how we communicate. In my family, I felt like we were very avoidant. So I learned that we didn't talk about things. And you grow up and you see your peers communicate with each other. Okay, that's how we talk or what we say or how we communicate, you know, perform our maybe values to each other, and on and on and on your whole life. But there's less spaces of like formal education around interpersonal communication, at least. Which is where my heart really lies. And so I think for me, just circling back to podcasting, to me, this is a space of being intentional, if not formal, you know, not maybe like at a university level, maybe at my university, at least, you know, everyone had to take a public speaking class. But I was sitting in my intro to interpersonal class going, hang on, this is the class everybody should be taking, because everyone has that. They're like, everyone will speak. You have to take the public speaking class. But they're not really making that same argument for the interpersonal class, which I think is just an interesting side note. But again, doing something like a podcast where I'm sharing it is, again, an opportunity for me to practice being intentional in my communication. I feel very open, but also specific about how I approach asking questions. And also, maybe you'll notice not asking questions. I just like to share a story and pause and, you know, let you respond with what you want to respond with. Um, and I am there again, a lot of things. I just want to name a lot of things floating around my head right now, so I don't know exactly how coherent this is sounding. But I think I'll choose this as a moment to pause and just ask, you know, what you're hearing and what I'm saying or what it's making you think of.
Yeah. There's also a million things that I could say. My mind is also going in so many different directions, which is
This is
actually
kind of my MO. Yeah.
looking at our conversation that we're having right now. For me, there's definitely a sense of flow. It just flows. There is no effort in like, oh my gosh, what am I going to ask her or like talk about? And it's I like that sort of unpredictability and the surprise that can be part of conversations. And sort of, I say something, it brings a lot of associations or memories for you. You say something, I respond to that, and we're just sharing stories back and forth. And it's a really beautiful thing, and it's very unplanned. I know that like yourself, you in advance you sent me like a list with some questions that you wanted to cover, and I typically do the same when I would be interviewing someone on a podcast because it is usually a nice thing for the person who's going to be a guest to sort of know where is this going to go. But me myself, I typically prefer conversations that we don't really know what the questions are going to be, and we're just
Hmm.
going to see how it develops because the conversation itself is a story. And the unplanned ones tend to be my favorite ones. Now, I tend to be like that in research as well, which is not always great because it's
Sure.
less structured.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
I'm very much not a structured person in my conversations, and I love to go with the flow. Um, but it is also something that you can develop as a skill, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so.
And I agree with what you said on the importance of interpersonal skills and communication. I also think in academic contexts, I didn't even have any public speaking
Mm.
classes. There was a lot of academic writing. There was always an emphasis on written communication, but never on
Yeah,
spoken
sure.
communication. This is actually part of what I'm writing about in the book, where, podcasting as a research method, I see it as part of sound-based scholarship as
Mm.
opposed to written word. So the idea of spoken word. Another thing that I did after I completed my master's and I produced this podcast about Cambridge and the pandemic is that I analyzed all of the information, all the data, and then I wrote um, data poems. So
Mm.
using snippets and quotes from different interviews, I sort of did a thematic analysis and then I wrote poems and then I put them to music that I composed. And it became a spoken word album
Wow.
made out of research data. And I have just been really intrigued by the position of spoken word, speech, speaking skills, and how we create knowledge through speech and speaking with one another in conversation, as opposed to sitting there by yourself and doing some writing, which is just a very different way of thinking, which is way more insular, isolated, you on your own, which is also great. Not it's not better or worse, but
Yeah.
it's just different. But there's in the academic world, there's not the same level of appreciation or acknowledgement for knowledge that is created through
Hmm.
spoken ways. Yeah.
I'm feeling that right now as I'm working on writing a paper for a conference, and I'm just wishing, oh, I'm such a verbal processor. It's like, oh, I wish I could just submit a video or a podcast of me and my, co-authors writing together, and maybe I should try to push for that and change things from within things. But I think that you've shared a great point about our shared perception coming into this of being okay with and even preferring the emergence and the unknown of the conversation, which I think proves my point of it's co-created because in it as part of, I name myself as like the representative of the communication perspective. As part of that, I am always pushing for the exploration, and I'm wanting to ask open-ended questions, and I'm wanting to be open to where the conversation's going to go. And sometimes whoever my conversation partner is, I feel a little more pushback on that, where we get to the end of the conversation, I maybe stop recording and they go, I hope that was what you wanted it to be. What was that? They're expressing maybe like some confusion or some doubts about like what was that? What did we just do? And I'm always reassuring like that was the point. Like the process is the point to me. The meandering, the exploration, the maybe you don't, and it does admittedly make it difficult to market a podcast in a market that wants you to be like, here's my guest, here's their expertise, and here's what they're going to teach you today. Because that's not really what's happening in these conversations. But it really, what you can make, the point I'm trying to make that I want to get back to is that by you and me both being committed to the emergence, it creates something different than if, you know, your conversation partner is not committed to. And again, not better or worse, just different, and interesting for how you maybe invite people or how others invite you into ways of being to make each other feel relationally safe so that you
Mhm.
could lean into something like exploration. I think that some of the most valuable conversations I've had are with really heady academics who have maybe given presentations at conference or written a ton of papers. And then I get them on the podcast and I go, okay, what do you want to talk about? Or just like it, just the tone again, going back to what I was talking about at the very beginning, that I'm trying to set this like conversational, maybe informal tone that allows for exploration. It creates something totally different than the way that
Mhm.
anyone else maybe has acted or interacted with this person's work before, either through
Yeah,
like a presentation or a class or a writing. And I think that can just be really, really powerful.
it absolutely can. And it's about relinquishing control in this way. If you don't know what
Mm-hmm.
questions come, if you haven't prepared your answers, I mean, you could do all those things, but then it takes away the flow of the conversation and the elements that to me make many conversations so enriching and
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, delightful often. So it's relinquishing control, which actually means you're quite vulnerable. If you go into a
Mm-hmm.
conversation and you're not quite sure what's going to happen or which way is it going to go, it feels vulnerable because you're unprepared, and it's a different mindset. It's a mindset of playfulness and okay, let's see where this goes, and openness. Um, and I think some contexts are easier to do that in than others. So let's say if you go for a job interview, that's a particular type of conversation you're going to have there.
Mm-hmm.
If you go on
Mm-hmm.
a first date, it's a particular type of conversation which often has similar types of questions that people will be asking. If you go on a podcast interview, again, it's a different way of speaking or relating to one another. If you go and give a talk in public about your work, it's again a different situation. I'm actually quite interested in how the way we speak changes with each of those different settings,
Mm-hmm.
and not just what we say, what we talk about, but then also how we speak is quite different. And that's a really fascinating thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. The thing, I'm just being aware that I want to be wrapping us up soon. And I think something I want to come back to is the idea of how we learn through communication and the way that the coordinated management of meaning theory, which all my work is rooted in, what the language that it would use is to say that all of our conversations have an afterlife. And I'm curious to ask you about how your podcasting experiences have an afterlife in your life. And as I think about that for myself, what's coming up is I just find it to be so true, first of all, that, you know, what happens in my podcasts, the content that is explored, the way that it is explored, it does not stay within the 1 hour, you know, of audio that exists in the world. It really changes me. And I think the biggest example of that within the podcast that I've referenced before, because it's just obvious to me and kind of funny maybe to look back on, is that when I did start this podcast 5 years ago, I would send like 10 questions in advance for a 60-minute conversation because I believed that being prepared would, and kind of already in my head having an idea this is what the conversation's going to be, that would be the best
Mhm.
outcome offering. You know, that was the way to get to the best, most meaningful offering as a podcast that you then share. And so I was really like strict and committed to my thing. And so someone would say something interesting and I'd go, okay, cool, next question, and like look to question number two. And so I wasn't able to follow the natural flow of like where maybe my conversation partner was trying to lead me or where we could have gone together if I was more open to it. And so over the years only have I gotten to the point where I'm now, where again, like you said, I sent you 3 questions. One of them was introduce yourself. I kind of asked the second question, I think, just because I knew we would talk about your book. And everything we're talking about has kind of been the third question, just talking about the stories of our experiences. But it's taken me a long time, 5 years, but in my heart, and 165 podcasts, it's taken a long time to get to the point
Yeah.
where I feel like I can fully embrace that more emergent way of being, particularly as someone that does. I was like, I don't think this is a thing all over the world. I did something called show choir when I was in high school, and that was like a competitive thing where we put together this whole routine of singing and dancing. And then on weekends, we go compete with it. I did something called speech where I would write or memorize a 10-minute speech and perform it. So I was in a lot of these like competitive environments. I was very much like a straight A student. I really wanted to perform. And so from all of those lessons in my life, I came to the conclusion of like, the practice makes perfect kind of thing, like well rehearsed. I make it so well rehearsed that it looks unrehearsed in my speech examples. First of all, that became how, like, okay, that's how you create something good. You hyper prepare. And so it's been a lot of unlearning of that lesson for me to say that no, just because I don't know exactly where this conversation is going to go, that doesn't mean I'm unprepared. It doesn't mean I don't care, because I want to like respectfully steward, the conversation as well. I'm actually so prepared. I'm unplanned, but I'm prepared for how the conversation goes, because I've come to the conclusion that the being open to the emergence and being confident in myself and my conversation partners as improvisers within that is what sets the conditions for
Yeah.
a great conversation, which
Okay.
could look like many things, I think.
Yeah.
But it's just a lesson I've learned over my podcasting that also expands into my life. I think like I like to travel, and I get to travel for my work sometimes. And I used to be a very like stressed and planned traveler, and now I like actively try to be more emergent. So I have to eat gluten free. So in advance, I look at the places where I know I can eat, and that's pretty much it. And then I get there, so oh, maybe I'll go to this museum, or maybe I'll go walk down here today. And it's a practice for me. It is, again, to go back to just research.
Yeah.
It's me learning something every time. So I'm just curious about podcasting as the medium for you, what it has taught you, or what it opens your eyes to in your life of your practice in podcasting and outside of it, if there's anything.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I'm typically very unprepared, quote unquote.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't like rehearsing anything or memorizing anything. I get bored quickly, and it just out naturally. It's just not my way of doing things. And I have found in podcasting actually a way of being how I like to be, which is unprepared, but not in a negative way of like being lazy, but like
Yeah.
being open to whatever will emerge in the moment. And that is what conversations to me are all about. So yeah, I fully agree with what you're describing. And I'm the same. I travel a lot.
Yeah.
And way back in the day, I was like really planned. On this day, I'm going to take a flight there, and I'm going to go there, and I'm going to do this trip and then that hike. And then I very quickly learned that my plans would like change from like day 2 after arrival, because things would come on my path and I wanted to explore something else. And I've just really
Mhm.
stopped planning anything.
Yeah.
So the way I enter conversations is often similar to how I approach life, although
Mhm.
you do have to plan certain things, obviously. But there's a lot of like openness. Let's see what comes on my path, which again, to many people will feel like a form of insecurity because you
Yeah.
don't know
I think
what the
it's a
next.
real skill to develop, like a comfort with
Yeah,
the uncomfortable
yeah,
truth of
yeah,
not knowing. Yeah.
yeah. But I think that's part of not knowing and just being the delight of
Mhm.
surprising conversations. Podcasting has been a way for me to embrace that both in my research and in other contexts. Same goes for my coaching podcast. It's called The Smart Rebel. That's my company name as well. And I used to ask people in advance that I would coach, like, what is the issue you want to focus on? How can I sort of, what do you want to do? So
Mm-hmm.
that I had this idea, I should be prepared before coaching someone. I should really think ahead about how to work through this issue with this person. And then I just realized that no, actually, I deliver my best coaching if I don't know anything before we enter the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have learned to trust myself that things will emerge in a moment. And every single time I have delivered a conversation where afterwards people leave thinking, damn, my world just expanded. I
Mm-hmm.
suddenly understand why this is happening. I now know what I need to do, or whatever it is, whatever the outcome, every single time there has been the exact outcome that people needed from that conversation. And that is also a skill. So in some contexts, it's actually better to not be prepared.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, podcasting has been a way to engage in that delightful activity and to share with other people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. One last question is coming to mind that I feel like I have to ask because I've been thinking about
Yeah.
this. I don't know if you yourself are also an enjoyer of listening to other podcasts, but I am. I probably don't listen to a ton, but I have a couple I'm very committed to. And one that I have recently listened to somewhat is there's a comedian named Amy Poehler who has started a podcast called Good Hang, and it just won like the first podcasting award of whatever. And people are really complimenting her interview skills. And it's driving me crazy because I feel like she reminds me of me when I first started podcasting, basically, with the story I
Yeah.
just told. Like her, and I guess I'm verbose as well. I know I meander and I take a long time to ask a question. But I feel like her style of interviewing, and again, the whole point is that it's just a good hang. It's just hanging out. It's not trying to do anything. But I feel like she asks such pointed questions and clearly has such an agenda for like how it goes. That's just what I've perceived. And so it kind of frustrates me that people are like, wow, that's incredible interviewing. And I'm like, oh, if only you knew what I
Mm.
knew or like saw my style and how open it was and what it created, you maybe wouldn't think that. And so I'm curious about how you situate yourself in the larger scheme of podcasts and how
Mm.
you feel the work that you're doing differs from or learns from or works together with kind of the existing world of podcasts, which I think is only getting bigger and
Mm.
richer. And I hope we are learning from each other, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I would think that that's her style of
Mm-hmm.
interviewing and approaching conversations, but your style and my style is just as legit
Yeah.
and can be successful. It's just a different approach, and it's not better or worse. It's
Mm-hmm.
different. And that variety is actually what makes the podcasting world so enriching.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than starting to doubt yourself and thinking, oh, maybe I should actually be more structured in my approach, just think, oh, that's great that that's working out for
Yeah.
her and her podcast. But for me, what I really love doing is this and that. If I go to an academic conference, there's a lot of people that are very prepared and
Mm.
they've typed out everything that they're going to say and they've got everything structured. Me, I just show up with my
Yes.
PowerPoint with a couple bullet points and I just start talking. And I've never even beforehand practiced or timed, but I just trust that things are going to turn out fine. And they
Mm-hmm.
do every single time. And if I were to rehearse it, it was just, it would take a lot of the charisma and energy
Mm-hmm.
away. So just appreciate how you like to do things. And we don't always need to be doing things in the exact same way. And that's what's so
Yeah.
beautiful about podcasting. There's literally all the freedom in the world, all the
Mm-hmm.
creativity. You can be whoever you want to be. And that's what I love. There's no
Mm-hmm.
rules.
You're right. You're right. I need to let it go maybe that it's not one or the other. I just again am so passionate about, like you said, good conversation. And I've just come to be such a believer in the openness to the other
Hmm.
person is what creates the conditions for a really meaningful conversation. So it feels like it goes against what I'm seeing her do or other podcast hosts do. So it messes with my brain a little bit. But like you said, it just creates something different. And that's the point that, again, I feel like I talked to you forever. So we should probably follow up on this because I think there's so much more learning here to do. But as we are wrapping up, finally, I know I said it before, I'll actually let us end now. um, I'm curious just to broadly open it up to you in our last minutes and say what else about your book that's just come out, about the specific ways you're talking about using podcasting as a research method, if you want to speak to that, what you've learned from this process. What do you want to leave people with who are listening to this episode?
Well, if I look at both my life and my career in academia, one thing that is a common thread is that I don't really play things by the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And that has sometimes gotten me into trouble, fair enough. But it's also led to some of my biggest successes. So, me starting out podcasting back in the day when I was doing my master's thesis at Cambridge, there was a lot of people that weren't quite a fan of this idea because it wasn't a traditional sort of validated method
Mm-hmm.
that is common practice. It was very different from what you typically are supposed or expected to do as a student.
Right.
I still sort of pushed through and was very stubborn about it. And it led me to win research awards on my podcasting work. It's led me to this book deal where now people have a practical guide on how to use
Yeah.
podcasting as a research method. It's led to a lot of career successes for me to sort of ignore the naysayers and
Yeah.
be stubborn and be experimental and playful and be like, you know what? How about we try it this way? And I know it's
Mm-hmm.
never been done before, but who cares? Because we're just going to see what this might lead to in a very sort of lighthearted way. And that sense of playfulness is what I take with me in anything I do. And it's just been it's really been responsible for many of my successes. So I would encourage other people to also be experimental and playful in
Mm-hmm.
their work, in their lives, and break some rules and see what happens and approach things differently. And I think this book, I present three different ways in which you can use podcasting as a research method. One is as a participatory action research method. One is as an elicitation method, and one as an ethnographic podcasting method. And I give you everything you need in order to sort of, run with it and produce your own podcast. But I also allow for a lot of space, and I encourage the reader throughout to sort of play with my ideas because it's just suggestions. And you could
Mm-hmm.
take this element, but leave that out and sort of go to the next chapter and take something from there and create your own thing. And I think that creativity in research and in life, how you
Mm-hmm.
create your own life and how you write your own life story. Speaking of meaning making,
Yeah.
it applies to anything. And it's a big blessing for me. I feel in my life and work to have this attitude that I would love to inspire others to also practice a bit more often. Yeah.
You're absolutely inspiring me right now. I'm literally just thinking about I'm gonna message my co-author and be like, let's just submit a video podcast. Let's not even write a paper and just see what happens. I think that's such an important, yeah, let's invite each other. Let's expand the ways of being that it from, within the systems we're in. So I think that's really beautiful, Simone.
Take some risks.
Yes,
Exactly.
I'm certainly feeling inspired. So it's working at least on one person, and I hope the listeners feel that as well. So, Simone, seriously, thank you so much for your time and your perspective. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope we can stay in touch and keep talking about podcasting because I just think there's so much to learn from each other.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invite. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you today.
Thanks, Simone. Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. You can email questions, reflections, ideas, and stories to storieslived.storiestold@gmail.com for a chance to be featured in an episode. You can comment on our Instagram at Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod, or the CMM Institute YouTube page to engage with other listeners. And you can subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to make sure you're getting every episode right in your inbox. Links to all these places can be found in the show notes for this episode. Other ways you can support this podcast are by following, rating, and reviewing the show wherever you listen. Plus, please share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution, an organization dedicated to furthering the coordinated management of meaning theory and practice of communication. More information about CMM can be found at cmminstitute.substack.com. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.